Hello, and welcome to the Nurturing Resilience podcast, where me, your host, Leisha Nelson, weaves together the worlds of somatics, science, and energetics to nurture a deeper connection to yourself. This is a podcast that covers a span of topics and ideas, from guest storytelling their rites of passage that catalyzed their resiliency, to nervous system and mind-body health education, to deep contemplation on topics such as cultivating connection to ourselves and others in a complex world. I'm an occupational therapist, somatic practitioner, and body worker, attachment specialist, and baby whisperer, with over 20 years of experience with mind-body connection and supporting matrescence. What you're receiving today and listening today is the uncut version of my podcast. This is where I interview guests and I don't do any editing. You're getting it all in the raw. If you're interested in my podcast, you can find that on Spotify, which is the edited version. And if you're interested in my work, you can follow me on Instagram at Leisha Nelson and also through my website at leishanelson.com. If you enjoy what you hear today, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it on your social media pages with your friends, your family, your loved ones. Let the world know that it's here. If you really like it, you can follow me and write a review. That's how my podcast gets out to listeners like you. And this important information about the body, somatics, and nervous system can find more people that need it. All right, thanks so much, and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to today's episode. I'm happy to have you here for session number 2 or podcast number 2 of Nervous System November. So go back and listen to episode number 1. I'll link that in the notes below, where I share about interoception. I start to dive into the different aspects of the nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. So this is a continuation or a little bit deeper dive into part 1. Nervous System November means November, we're talking about nervous systems. We are doing a 4-part series to this podcast, and this is week 2. So welcome to week 2, where we're going to dive into what's called Polyvagal Theory. I know it's a really big word. When this first came out and was introduced to me, I was actually in yoga teacher training. And it was really complicated. It felt so complex. And at the time when it was first introduced, it was. Steven Porges, who is the brilliant mind behind Polyvagal Theory, has years of research and years of information. And like I said, a brilliant mind. He really does. And when he first came out with this theory, like I said, I remember when this was being introduced, it was so hard to grasp, and people were asking me questions. And what has happened since then is the information has gotten more clear. Some of his students have come out and presented it in ways that were more easier grasped by the general public. And I love this theory. I think this theory explains so much about childhood development, relationship, why we might show up the ways that we show up, habitual patterns that might be happening in our nervous system that really started in infancy and really started when we were newborns, and what was happening in our relationships with our attachment figures, usually our parents, and then how that carries over into how we show up today in our relationships, and how our nervous systems show up in our relationships. And like I shared last week, so much of this stuff we aren't even conscious of. So much of how we're reacting and responding and showing up in the world, specifically in our attachment patterns and in our relational fields with other people, started in our earliest times as newborns and what was happening and what was playing out in our relationships with usually our parents or whoever was mostly caring for us at that time. I would like to add that I am reading Gabor Mate's new book, The Myth of Normal. I'm loving this book. I'll link that below as well, because he really dives into what's happening to us as infants, what's happening. He goes into conception, which I am just celebrating. I'm a huge fan that there's starting to be better understanding and better awareness of how our conception is imprinting into our nervous system. He goes into the birth process. He's going into parenthood, really explaining on really simple really explaining in simple terms how this is working into our nervous system. And he's pulling in the science. He's speaking as a physician that has worked with this for, I don't know how long he's been in the field. It's been a really long time. And so I'm loving that this information is coming into our everyday language. This is really starting to be, this is something I've intuited for years, that our preconception, our conception, and our birth imprints massively into our system. Gabor Mate is supporting this work. Polyvagal theory supports this work and really explains like, okay, here's what's happening at the brain level. Here's what's happening with our cranial nerves. We'll get into what cranial nerves are. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. But they explain it in a way that says, here's the science. This is why imprints make such a huge difference into our nervous system. And it all starts in conception, at birth, and as polyvagal theory goes into, in our relationships with our attachment figures. So again, if you haven't listened or you don't know what the autonomic nervous system is, please go back and listen to that previous podcast, because I'm going to be talking about that right now today. So as I explained last week, the original idea about the autonomic nervous system, and it's still true to this sense, but pre-polyvagal theory is that the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, has two branches, and these two branches are parasympathetic and sympathetic. Steven Porges came in, and polyvagal theory came in and actually said, well, I'm going to talk about three aspects. There's actually three branches. One of those branches specifically, and the main star of polyvagal theory, is the vagus nerve. So our nerves from our body come, from our spine, and they go out into our muscles, they go out into our musculoskeletal system, they go out into our sensory system, and they're coming from spinal segments. And this is how most of our body moves, receives information, communicates, is through these spinal segments, through these nerves. There are a set of nerves in the brain. They're not coming from the spine, they're in the brain, and that's why they're called cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves. They're all very closely related. Most of them sit on the brainstem. There are 12 cranial nerves. They're very closely related. They're close to each other anatomically on the brain. They are what control a lot of our face, a lot of our smiles, our taste receptors, what allows us to move our eyes back and forth and side to side, our smell, that I know that I'm touching my cheek right now. They really are involved with our face. The vagus nerve, however, is it might be the longest nerve in the body. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that 100%. I'm pretty sure it is the longest nerve in the body. It's the 10th cranial nerve of the 12. it's called the vagus nerve because vagus literally means wanderer. And it literally wanders through our body. It starts, like I said, in the brainstem, but it comes out through the cranium, the occipital cranial base, the big opening or the foramen, and goes down and literally goes to our heart, our lung, our kidneys, our intestines. Parts of it even go to the cervix, not the whole womb, but parts go to the cervix, the sensory parts. It goes to our diaphragm. It goes down into all of our organs, and it's both a sensory and a motor. So in addition to sensory and motor, it does what is called efferent and afferent. Basically, what that means is it sends information in both directions. So it can send information from the body up into the brain, and then from the brain down into the body. So it does both. Like, this is a massive part of how our body works, how our nervous systems works, how we receive information from the body. Now, it's estimated that 80% of the information actually comes from the body to the brain. So the way that we perceive the world, what's happening around us, whether we're conscious of it or not, is actually coming in from the body, sensory and motor. And that information a lot of that information is coming in from all those organs that the vagus nerve is innervating and communicating with. And all those gut instincts, that's where the term gut instincts comes from, is literally the information coming from our guts. 80% of it gets then communicated to the vagus nerve and sent to the brain. So our brain has an understanding of what's actually happening in our body. So, as I was saying prior to describing the vagus nerve and what it does, before polyvagal theory, it was like, okay, there's two branches. There's the fight or flight and the rest and digest. That's it. Steven Porges came in and said, actually, no, it's more complex than that. And there's more than two branches. It involves the vagus nerve. And basically, his theory gave us a really good map. And this map is the basis and the architecture. It's like the underlying foundation for how we develop social engagement, our perception of safety, and our ability to self-regulate. So when things go awry in this foundation, we can have major side effects, right? So if things go awry, especially in infancy or as a child, we have issues with social engagement. We have issues with actually interpreting whether we're safe or not. And we might not have a great capacity to regulate our own nervous system. So of course, this ties in with interoception, understanding what's happening in our bodies, interpreting that from a sensory perspective, and really understanding, am I safe? Can I regulate myself? And what are my skills for social engagement? So super key to Porges's model is understanding that healthy attachment is related to a sense of safety. When we have that sense of safety, we have the foundation for healthy further development of the autonomic nervous system. I'm just going to let that sink in. Again, the key being it all comes down to healthy attachment. So Porges really opened up a whole new door for what's happening in attachment in children. And specifically newborns and babies. And that when we have healthy attachment, we know we're safe. We know that we can show up authentically. When we have healthy attachment, we know we're safe. When we know we're safe, we have the ability to move through the world and engage socially with other people in a completely different way compared to those who don't feel safe. Porges's model basically gives an explanation for healthy play and healthy development and what that looks like as a child. And it basically says when our early attachment is disrupted, so are those important neural platforms. We're not born developed, right? Like we don't have the neurological wiring. So when we have healthy attachment, it means our body can develop those healthy neural pathways. Our nervous system develops in a very healthy way, which allows us for future self-regulation and future self-socialization. When that's disrupted, we don't have that in our nervous system. Now, I always like to share, I think this is really important, because when I start to talk about attachment, especially to mothers who have young children, they're like, oh my God, I totally have screwed up my children. I'm the worst mother. I hear that a lot. And so I think it's really important to point out with healthy attachment, two aspects actually, but one being 30%. Research has shown a child really only needs 30% of healthy attachment to become a functional, self-regulated, emotional, intelligent human being. So 30% isn't that much. And so don't beat yourself up if you're sitting here going, I've totally screwed everything up for my child. You haven't. You haven't. And I know I said that there were two things. I'm totally blanking the second thing right now. That's what's funny and fun about these podcasts is that I do them live. I'm doing very little editing. When the second thing comes in, I'll share it with y'all. But just keep in mind, 30%, that's okay. Now, we're not going to get into all the nuances of attachment theory in this episode. It is definitely something I can dive into. It is definitely something I get a ton of questions about. There are many different resources, education, professionals out there sharing about different attachment styles. There's lots of different books. I personally studied with Diane Poole-Heller. I chose to study with her because she involved a somatic perspective to it, and she was a somatic experiencing practitioner. That is where I get 90% of my information from attachment. It's not coming from me. It comes from studying with her and her organization. So I always like to give credit to my teachers and to the lineage. So all that information is out there. I'm happy to share on that on future podcasts. Especially after this one and diving into polyvagal theory. And once you're kind of understanding polyvagal theory, you'll be like, it makes understanding attachment and attachment styles so much easier. We're not going to get into that today because it's just too much. But just know that polyvagal theory and Porges' model, his model, gave a lot and contributed a lot to the fields around relationships and attachment. And I'm really appreciative of it. It really makes a lot of sense to me when we start to dive into these different models and these different theories. So his model basically breaks things down into 3 branches, not the original 2. So he came along and basically said, okay, we have the autonomic nervous system, the things that are happening automatically. There's definitely a parasympathetic aspect to the autonomic nervous system, which we've talked about. He calls this the ventral parasympathetic. Ventral literally meaning front. So when I think about ventral or front, it's everything in the front part of my body. So this is where we get our face. This is where we get our eyes. This is where we get our mouth. This is where, you can imagine a mother and a newborn smiling and a mother lovingly gazing at her newborn, smiling, cooing, making noises, telling the newborn that she loves it. This is all very ventral. And even in this moment, if you are able to, whether it's you as an infant or remembering, or maybe you have children, what that's like, just pausing, imagine holding your newborn child, gazing at them lovingly, smiling, touching their cheek. And you might notice in your body as you remember this memory or make up this memory, for me, I take a deeper breath, I sigh. And I notice that my heart feels a little bit warm and lit up. So I'm totally dropping into my parasympathetic system right now. So the ventral parasympathetic system is all about safety. It's all about social connection, this calm and this rest. It comes from eye contact. It comes from facial expressions like smiling and cooing. It puts us in our rest and digest system, and it creates this whole new level of connection. So that's ventral parasympathetic. It's one of the main branches. A second branch is sympathetic. We talked about this. This is pretty normal. We've heard about this. Basically, this is our fight or flight system. There's an active mobilization. There's a fight or flight. There's an increase in heart rate, breathing, arousal. We have a decrease in digestion, decrease in safety, decrease in our social engagements. And what's really interesting about this work is Steven really dove into what's happening in our sensory system, especially when we're in fight or flight. And basically, it's really difficult for us to extract human voices from the background. Meaning our hearing gets a little bit jumbled or really jumbled, and it's actually really hard to hear what people are saying. It's really hard to have music playing, be in a noisy place, connect with the person that might be trying to talk with us if we're a little bit in our sympathetic system. For me, I know if I'm having a more serious conversation with my partner, this actually happened in the car this morning, and I had to turn the music down because I'm very auditorily sensitive. And in order to take in what he was saying and keep my body in a very regulated state, I couldn't also listen to music and have the music playing at the same time. So these are things you can start to pay attention to in your body. And I know all of you listening know what the sympathetic state feels like. Unfortunately, most of us live in this state. So that's the second branch. What Steven introduced that was a little bit different was the dorsal parasympathetic. Dorsal meaning the back or behind, meaning it's coming the way the nerves innervated anatomically and what's happening, meaning it's coming from the back. And he separated out freeze here. He said freeze is a whole new mechanism. This is when we have immobility. This is when we have freeze. There is also a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in breathing. There's a decrease in muscle tone, especially the face. And we have no access to social engagement when we're in freeze. Going back to the face, that's really interesting. So if you have a mother that's depleted, exhausted, unsupported, in shock because she just had a huge traumatic birth. She's in a freeze state. Say that's what her body's putting her into. She's going to have decreased muscle tone in her face, and that is what plays out to the infant. So the infant is totally picking up on these cues. Infants know. That's how infants know that they are safe. That is the only way they know they are safe, because they co-regulate off the attachment figure, meaning whatever state the caregiver or the attachment figure is in, whatever state their nervous system is in, the newborn also goes into that state. So if a mother or father is in freeze, and this is showing through the face and through the muscle tone while the mother is holding the child is picking up on this. And a couple different things can happen depending on the physiology of the child. The child can also go into a freeze state. They can also go into that sympathetic state, that really anxious state, and become really activated in their nervous system because they don't feel safe. They know that the person holding them is not in their parasympathetic system, knows they don't feel connected with, knows the eye contact there isn't there, is picking up on all the senses in the parent's body and moves into those states as well. So from this example of the mother holding the child or the father, you can see how our very earliest memories coming from the body, 80% of it, our very earliest imprints are what then develop our nervous system. So in the example of the mother in freeze and the baby going into freeze, that baby then doesn't have that foundation that we spoke about earlier for, I don't want to call it correct, but just to develop into a ventral parasympathetic human being. The nervous system imprints, this world isn't safe. My reactions are to go into freeze. I cannot socially engage with anyone. In the other example, the infant could also go into the same state, just sympathetic. This world isn't safe. I'm going to have an increase in heart rate, breathing, arousal, and be anxious all of the time, or a lot of the time, or anytime anything feels a little bit stressful. My body's foundation now says, I need to have anxiety. Whoa. I'm just going to give a pause. Allow for a breath. That's a lot. That's a lot. So just a quick recap. Ventrovagal means safe and social. Sympathetic nervous system means mobilized, fight or flight. And that dorsal vagal means immobilized or collapsed. So when we start to understand the nervous system, when we start to understand it at this level, it really, for me, highlights like, oh, this isn't me. This is the way I'm wired. The way I'm reacting, the way I'm moving through the world, the way I'm engaging or not engaging socially, how safe I feel in each moment isn't me at the core. It's the way I was wired, and I can change that. My nervous system doesn't have to stay that way. It takes work, it takes time, but understanding, okay, these are my reactions that started as a foundation for me as a child, has really allowed me to create some compassion and some empathy towards myself. The other thing I want to point out is that the ventral vagal is myelinated. So that means that the nerves have this coating around these long tendrils that allow them to communicate quicker and faster and more accurate. The dorsal vagal is unmyelinated. So that makes it slower, and it actually leads to more inaccuracy. Again, when we don't feel safe, it's really hard to interpret the world accurately. And that becomes more of the imprint. And so starting to understand, there might be times when I was activated in my dorsal vagal where I was actually interpreting things really inaccurately. My past experiences were coming in, my past wiring, my past nervous system, my past traumas were coming in, and I'm allowing them to overplay in this current moment, and therefore I'm inaccurately reading what's happening. And I think that's really important to point out. Yes, always listen to your gut instincts. Yes, your deep inner knowing is super important. And also, you might have some tainted glasses on that's really not allowing you to interpret the world for what's actually happening, especially if there's a history of trauma, decreased social engagement, decreased safety as an infant or a very young child, or in utero. For me, that's another reason to be more empathetic with myself. Like, oh my God, I have this trauma. I think it's happening now, but it's not. And can I just be honest with the fact that, like, wow, I really might have misinterpreted what that other person was saying or what the situation was playing out because I was in my dorsal vagal. So I feel like I could go on and on about polyvagal. I feel like you have the main understanding of what this is. It's important for me to start to work with these different states. It's important for me to start to understand, what does your body feel like in these different states? How can I start to recognize I'm in these states? The more that we can recognize that we're in these states, we can work through some of that. Like I said, like maybe you're in your dorsal vagal and you're interpreting the situation and it's actually really inaccurate for what's happening. And so the more that we can start to interpret those different states, we can more accurately come into the present moment. And that allows us, especially in the relational field, to be with the person, to be with the actual person we're relating with for what's happening in the present moment. So there is a tool or a concept that is used a lot in polyvagal theory. I really like this visual. You want to think about your nervous system like a ladder. And you can move up and down the ladder, and the ladder has different rungs. And how we move up and down the ladder is actually automatic and involuntary. So just as I'm talking about, these things can come in. We don't mean to. It's just the past coming in, and all of a sudden we've moved up and down the ladder. So at the very bottom of the ladder is this freeze state. So this is at the very bottom, totally frozen, totally immobile. So there is a concept in polyvagal theory. I really like this visual or this concept. It makes it an easy way to understand what your body might be doing. And so we're going to use the visual image of a ladder. And we can move up and down the ladder. You can go up and down the rungs. And how we go up and down the rungs is actually very automatic and involuntary, just like I was speaking of. So at the very bottom of the ladder is where freeze. This is us completely collapsed and freeze. If you move up the ladder a little bit, then we come into immobilized or shut down. So not quite completely frozen, but still immobilized. If you move up the ladder a little more is where we then get into safe and social. So there is a visual or a way to start to understand in your own body what is happening. And we are going to use the visual of a ladder. And I always like to name where I learned my information from. There are a few places, a few organizations that are using the image of the ladder. For me personally, I learned it from Jessica McGuire. She's a physiotherapist out of Australia. So just like the ladder, there's different levels, different rungs of the ladder, and we can move up and down. And the way we move up and down is usually involuntary and automatic, happens without us thinking about it. So at the very bottom of the ladder is this freeze and collapse state. And if we go up another rung, we're into the immobilize and shut down. So these two rungs of the ladder, you might recognize, okay, this is the dorsal vagal activation. I'm numb, I'm disconnected, I'm spaced out. I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, I'm depressed. If we move down the ladder, even to the very bottom, that freeze collapse state, I'm collapsed, I'm frozen, I have nothing. So the bottom is freeze collapsed. We go into immobilize shutdown. Then we move into fight or flight. The next rung is mobilized panic. So you might recognize these as the sympathetic states. Fearful, anxious, worried, panic, anxiety, racing, heart rate's up, right? So we're in that sympathetic state. So fight or flight, mobilized panic. Then comes safe, social, and at the very top is engaged. So this is where we get into ventral vagal. This is where we're feeling at home inside our body. We're calm, we're at ease, we're able to communicate, we're able to be in the flow state, we're open to connection. So where and how we move up and down the ladder, we can use that visual to start to be like, okay, what's happening? And to point out in somatic work and really what happens in the body, when we're at this immobilized and freeze state, in order to go into this social engaged state, we actually have to move into this fight or flight state. We can't bypass this. A lot of times what I see in different types of work or people that don't understand what's happening with the nervous system is they try to take someone or they're working with someone from freeze straight into social engagement. You can't. You might see this in your child, and children are great to watch, to see. Like, just let them move through their bodies and their states, and they will show you this ladder. They'll go from freeze into a temper tantrum. They might go back down into freeze, depending if they're not able to co-regulate with you. So there's this freeze state, this anxious temper tantrum movement state, and then they're able to go into social engagement. And we're the same. So when we start to work with our stressors and our trauma, if we're in this very immobilized shutdown state, when we start to come out of it, we might have a lot of anger. We might have a lot that we need to then suddenly move through and movement around it before we can move into that calm and regulated state. It's really important not to bypass or skip any level from a somatic level. So, like, how, Leisha? How do we do all this? What does this mean? Like, great, polyvagal theory, but show me how to apply this to my life. So it's really learning about your own states, your traits that you have when you're in those states. Like, how do you show up in those states? What are the sensations in your body? What are you doing? And we start to do that by simply paying attention. Starting with interoception, you have to have interoception first and just noticing your senses. And you can start to build this in together, these different layers of interoception, noticing your senses, and then noticing where you are in your body at different times. So I'm going to give you a little exercise or a little activity to start with, or some questions to reflect upon. And I would highly recommend either journaling on these or sitting with these in some meditation when you have a time, quiet space, to start to get really contemplative. So you can start to label the different states now that you know. So when I'm in the sympathetic state, when I'm in that fight or flight state, what did it feel like? So even in this moment, you can think of a time, and I wouldn't choose a 10, like on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is like max sympathetic state. I wouldn't choose a 1. I'd choose something about between like a 4 and a 6, like an argument that wasn't a horrible argument, but enough to activate your nervous system into a sympathetic state. And just take a moment to recall what was happening. What were you doing? Who were you with? And as you remember and reflect and recall upon that sympathetic state, what did it feel like? What happened inside of the body? And if you can't remember, what's happening inside the body now as you're remembering this moment? How did you respond? Did you have an urge to respond, but maybe didn't? What did you say or think in this situation? So if you find yourself in a sympathetic state, 1-to-1 breathing or 1-to-2 breathing are excellent activities to move you back into that socially engaged state. So is movement. So movement is great. Going for a walk, dancing, a run. 1-to-1 breathing is literally inhale for 5 counts, exhale for 5 counts, or whatever number of counts feels good to you. 1-to-2 breathing would be like inhale for 3 counts, exhale for 6. So you're just doubling whatever your inhale is. That can really move us out of that state. And a really good contemplation question, and this one comes from Jessica McGuire, is when I'm in the sympathetic state, I am blank. Fill in the blank here, blank. And the world is blank. So for me, when I answer that question, when I'm in the sympathetic nervous system state, I am anxious. And the world is not a great place to be in. That's my belief, because I don't like feeling anxious. The world doesn't feel great. And so I can start to recognize from these questions, okay, When the world isn't a great place, when I'm having those thoughts, that's my cue of like, oh my God, I might be activated right now. When I start to reflect upon how my body feels, it feels like my body is vibrating when I'm in a sympathetic state. It feels very urgent. Like if I don't do something right now, the world is going to end. Right? So that's that question. When I'm in that nervous sympathetic state, I'm in urgency. And I have to do something right now or everything is going to fall apart. I have to react right now. And so I've started to recognize, okay, when I have those thoughts of urgency or when I'm acting from urgency, whoa, I'm not in my social engaged state. I'm not in my rest and digest system. I'm in my sympathetic state. And it cues me. And now I know, okay, I'm in those states. It's time for me to pause. It's time for me to take some breath. It's time for me to actually do nothing versus act from urgency. You can do the same things. We can do the same visualization. Again, don't choose a 10. Choose like a 3 to a 6. And reflect upon a time when you went into that dorsal vagal place, when you were in freeze, when you were depressed, when you did go into immobilize or shut down. What did it feel like? What was happening? What happened inside the body? And if you can't remember, like what's happening now when you reflect upon this? How did you respond? What did you say or think? Maybe even what happened to your sleep or your relationships. Again, we can ask that same question when I'm in the dorsal vagal state. I am blank and the world is blank. When I'm in the dorsal vagal state, I'm depressed. And the world feels flat. And I don't want to engage with anyone. So these can start to become my cues. When we're in a dorsal vagal state, it's sometimes really hard to get out of it because you're frozen, you're immobilized. But a really simple trick, if 2 simple tricks actually. One comes from Peter Levine and it's called VOO, VOO. And that helps move us out of this dorsal state. So it's literally an inhale breath in and a VOO. Until you naturally run out of breath. I would recommend doing this more than once. I would recommend playing with this. What happens when you do this breath? The other thing for dorsal vagal state is deep pressure, like deep proprioceptive. So hanging out under a weighted blanket, I call them squeezes, where you literally like squeeze your body, squeeze your arms with your hands, squeeze your legs, anything that's going to give you some deep contact to your deeper skeletal muscles can help move you out of that place. You could even stand up if you're sitting down, like get out of bed. If you're stuck in bed, like literally get out of bed. Do some wall squats, do some push-ups, like do some deep movements and move through your VOOs. And then last but not least, we can reflect upon a time when we are in our ventral vagal, when we're socially engaged, when the world feels safe and kind and loving, and we can move through the same process and ask the same questions. So think of a time when you're in that state. Recall it. What were you doing? What were you wearing? What was happening? Who were you with? And what does it feel like? What's happening inside the body, or what happened inside the body? How did you act? How did you speak? What did you say? How was your energy and your relationships? We can ask the same question. When I'm in the ventral vagal state, I am blank. The world is blank. When I'm in the ventral vagal state, I am relaxed and happy, and the world is really beautiful and amazing. Like, the world is a freaking miracle. Life is a miracle when I'm in this state. Even now, just speaking about it, I'm like, oh, I have a smile on my face. I'm totally going into ventral vagal. My eyes are lighting up. My cheeks are getting nice, rosy and round. My heart feels full. So it's really about creating this embodied awareness and practice. Notice the different states. States create your traits. Of course, the polyvagal theory, like I said in the very beginning, is huge. Diving into this stuff, I have spent years reading books and studying with different people to better understand this stuff. And I'm just giving you like the tip of the iceberg for what's out there. And I'm hopefully providing you with some different activities, some different ideas, but really just, how is this for my nervous system? What's happening in my own body? Because once, again, I say this all the time, once you start to understand your own nervous system, once you start to understand the imprints, once you start to understand, that's not me, that's not who I am at the core, like that's just my nervous system responding to past trauma and past imprints. Me, like I'm a blueprint of health and wellness. And we all have that ability and that capacity to tap into our blueprints of health. And I believe when we do, this world is going to just be such a more loving, happier, amazing place. All right, that's all I'm going to share for this week. As always, if you like this, please share it with someone. If this resonates with you and you have some comments or things you want me to share, things you want me to know, please share them with me. Let me know. If you have questions about or ideas about future podcasts, maybe you want to be a guest on my podcast, let me know. I love bringing people on. I love having guests. If you really like my work, please write a review, follow me on Instagram. Maybe you want to do one-on-one deeper work together where we can really start to understand what's happening in your nervous system, working with your different imprints and blueprints, specifically, and especially if you want to dive deeper into womb work, birth work, pre and postnatal care, nourishing fertility. I am here for it. I love working one-on-one with clients. It's just such a deeper way to understand your own nervous system and what's happening there. All right, I will see you next week for episode 3 of 4. we are going to dive into sleep. Sleep is so important for healing in the body and the nervous system. So we're going to just talk about some different ways to improve your sleep, what sleep does. Again, super important for your body. The last week, we're diving into gut health and how the guts are related to the nervous system. That's a huge topic as well. I'll just be providing like the tip of the iceberg. I could probably do a whole season on its own going into gut and the gut health, but we'll just start with the beginning. All right, guys, all of my information below, it will be below linked so that you can reach out to me or send me a message or jump on a consultation call with me if you want to do any deeper work. And I will see you next week.